Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we'll be diving into a big Eva Grift. Jonathan Leeman and Collin Hansen have a book coming, or that's already come out, published by the Gospel Coalition and Nine Marks, peddling the fact that church is essential. And this is in sharp contrast to the messaging of Big Eva, and specifically, at least Jonathan Leeman. And I think Collin Hansen was also going along with it at the time that they had in March of 2020. But, now that it's popular to come out and say church is essential, they already have a book ready to make some cash money. So we're going to dive into that and just kind of expose this grift for what it is. So let's just talk about, let's just dive right in. But first, I do want to read some of the key scripture before we dive right on in. Let's see, Hebrews 10, chapter, verse 23. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day is drawing near. So a couple of assumptions is that there will be some Lone Ranger Christians out there, and that is not good. That's not good. It's not good for man to be alone. It's also not good for the Christian to be alone. And I would argue that the church was wavering. If you want to go back to verse 23, collectively the church wavered on this issue. And of course, not only did they waver on this issue, they peddled fear and panic porn, but they also encouraged others to disobey, verse 24 and 25. So that needs to be repented of collectively. So I want to point out this book. It's called Rediscover Church, Why the Body of Christ is Essential, the Gospel Coalition and Nine Marks. This is a joint operation, a joint venture, primarily because the two authors are from the two different organizations. Collin Hansen is a podcaster over at the Gospel Coalition, and Jonathan Leeman is one of the big shots, big heads at Nine Marks, and I believe he works very closely with Mark Dever. So with that said, let's dive right into this podcast that they gave on September 28th, 2021, where they address some of these issues, and I want to provide more context to what they're saying as they explain the rather obvious question that is implied by this video is, how are these people not hypocrites? Let's see them actually try to wrestle with that question
as well. Let's keep on that topic of just some of the difficulties that churches have faced in terms of responding to the last year. And last year, Jonathan, you warned against churches that were gathering under certain conditions, or at least you disagreed with certain churches and how they were meeting. Now you've written a book with me saying that the gathered church is essential. Doesn't that just make you a big old hypocrite?
Yeah, it does. Now, keep in mind, they're not actually representing Jonathan Leeman's position, because Jonathan Leeman was very pro-lockdown. He was very pro-lockdown, and they're making it seem like he was giving a lot of wiggle room on this issue. I don't think he does, and I'll show you the article later on, but let's watch him answer.
Okay, let's go there.
Yeah, we're going there.
We're going here.
First of all, I would say you mischaracterized what I said. I don't purposely or not, but what you said is not quite what I said.
Well, go ahead. Just clear it up.
Yeah, no doubt. I don't think I ever said churches shouldn't gather.
Yes,
what I said,
under certain conditions, it was not wise. I thought that's what you said.
Well, what I said, it was, this was in response to a particular pastor and his elders calling churches
John
together.
MacArthur.
And saying that, as I understood, as I read the article at the time, was a matter of faithfulness and courage. If you are going to be faithful and if you are going to follow Christ and love Christ more than Caesar, you will gather. And I think that might have been a great decision for that congregation. I have no quarrel with them. Where I pushed back was just a way of saying, hey, other churches need to be free to make different decisions according to their contexts, according to what their elders have before them. So just kind of a note here for Christian freedom, to leave churches to make other decisions or different decisions, each in accordance with its context, and not, as it were, judge one another, not bind the consciences of other congregations as, hey, this is necessarily the way of faithfulness for all churches. And I think people misunderstood what I was saying as discouraging churches to gather. I try to make it very clear that wasn't what I was saying, because I also said in that same piece, the very church that's calling us to gather can still gather. They can just do it outside.
Right.
It's not a particular form of gathering we're called to. So I never, made those claims.
Actually, he did, not particularly in the article that he's referencing. So he's referencing this article, A Time for Civil Disobedience, a response to Grace Community Church's elders. And this is about John MacArthur. And, and John MacArthur issued a great statement on the issue 4.5 months in, after being very wrong on the issue, but he did a turnaround, came to the right conclusion that churches are to gather, that the government has no authority on this issue. Jonathan Leeman in this piece basically wants Christians to submit to the government as much as they can, and that's not exactly the role that we should be. That's not exactly legitimate here, because the church. The government has no authority to dictate the ecclesiastical matters of the church. That is not their authority. They don't have the authority to say that a church can't gather, or how they must gather, whether they can sing or not, whether they can wear masks or not. They don't have any of that authority. So, with that said, it's very terrible logic, and he wants to equate it to churches in China not having more than 200 members, so that the police don't touch them. And let's say that's true. And I would actually agree with that, but it's also more effective for those churches to be smaller, more spread out. And I think it's more effective to have a church in China under 200 members. So this isn't even a government compliance issue. I think it's more effective to have a church under 200 members in general, even in the United States, because bureaucracy kills. So this wasn't a very good piece, and it got lambasted over a year ago, because this was written in July of 2020, late July, when MacArthur responded, and Jonathan Leeman had to come over the top rope. Let's read his last paragraph. Let's make sure we don't pass judgment on one another, but instead accept one another. And he's citing Romans 14 and 15. This attitude should characterize a conversation between Christians, between churches, and even between church leaders and members as they come to different conclusions, as challenging as that might become. We must make every effort to do with what leads to peace and to mutual edification, even if that means you decide to leave one church for another. I guess that's a reference to Romans 14, verse 19, because you have become convinced your leaders are making the wrong call. Go in peace, charity, and grace. So let me just pull up Romans 14:19 for a second here, because that's an interesting thing to me. So we can pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. Well, I don't know how you can build up one another and decide to impose lockdowns and mask mandates on your church. That is, to me, sinful. That is not the church should not be locking down for COVID. That was always a sin. And this isn't a Romans 14 Christian liberty issue. So this is, this is a sin and obedience issue. This has a clear command in Hebrews chapter 10 to not forsake the assembly of the saints. These churches not only forsook that assembly, but commanded in many cases, their congregations to forsake that same assembly as well. And that's a no-go. That's sinful. And that was Jonathan Leeman's position in May of 2020. So if we want to rewind the clock just a little bit more, let's read this last paragraph where he basically summarizes his own beliefs, my personal judgment, I see no reason to think that the government will single out churches, and I believe it possesses a compelling reason to ban all gatherings in order to fulfill its basic function of preserving life. So churches should submit to government restrictions on gatherings for the foreseeable future. Plus, Christians should utterly exhaust all ordinary means of legal recourse before contemplating disobedience. And there's one more reason to obey the government's ban on gathering at this present moment. I believe it aids our witness. It shows care for the community and love for our neighbors. It shows that we care about their good too, not just our own. And that is some soft-minded logic that came out of Jonathan Leeman in 2020. Again, that was sinful logic by someone who does not understand the times. Obviously, it did not help the church's witness. Instead, the church was being exactly like the world, peddling the same message of the world. We're all in this together. We're all in this together. Stay home. Slow the spread. All these things that the church was peddling, all these lies and mantras that the church was peddling, just like the world was peddling. How is that good for the church's witness to say the exact same thing that the world is saying? Wear your mask, get the jab. All these things that the world was saying, the church was largely saying, Big Eva was saying. So that's a good indication that this wasn't the case. Also, the idea that the church having to be singled out for a policy to be evil is just a fallacy. Evil is evil regardless of whether or not it specifically targets a church or just gyms. Like, this is stupid logic, and this is what Jonathan Leeman was peddling. He's very disingenuous about his opposition towards John MacArthur's church gathering, and it's just not fair to say that that's what he believed the entire time.
So I think I have uniformly said, hey, it's good for churches to gather. Churches must, and I would say this, if you want to push me a little bit, I would say churches must ordinarily gather. I do think there are exceptions. I think there are emergencies. So if your church building burns down, I wrote about this in the book One Assembly. If your church building burns down and you can't find another place to meet, well, you just can't gather. Historically, these have been called providential hindrances. When you get sick, you're hindered by providence from attending church. When your church building burns down, or when the government says you can't meet here right now because we're trying to protect your lives, that's a providential hindrance. And at that moment, you can decide we're going to defy the government or we're not going to defy the government. And all I'm saying is, in those exceptional, extraordinary moments, not ordinary moments, let each church and each church's elders make its own decisions.
It does seem to have been a confusing point for a number of people, because one of the things I wrote about in the guest,
as I already said, this wasn't a Romans 14 Christian liberty issue. This is a sin and obedience issue.
Essay I did for the New York Times was on the importance of gathering, but that also came in the context of my church's decision last summer to meet in a parking deck, distanced, and with masks, and how much, even though I had a lot of skepticism about how that was going to work out,
Can I just comment about how homosexual and that sounds? Like, seriously, how effeminate does that sound to meet in a parking deck, which I assume is a parking garage? And his church is in Birmingham, Alabama, I believe. So this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. This is an effeminate pastor, and that's an effeminate church. This is just stupid, and his church was stupid for doing that. That's just sickening. I would not have gone back to that church.
I'm glad that we did that rather than simply having stayed in virtual church the entire time there. Yeah. So, that seems there's a lot of confusion about, okay, if you're saying gathering, and by the way, this criticism has come to us from both sides. If you're saying gathering, that must mean indoors with no distancing, with masks, and with a certain defiance toward the government.
I think he means without
masks.
That's
just not anything that we have said or demanded. And you're right, when you're making the argument for Christian freedom, it seems to be you're prone to being misunderstood right now. Let's continue.
I think well, let me just say two things there.
Sure.
Number one, I think we have, as Christians, evangelical Christians, an underdeveloped view of Christian freedom. I think when somebody invokes Christian freedom, people necessarily or construe that to mean, oh, this isn't really important. This is a relative matter. Well, no, not necessarily. I might have a strong conviction here. It's just that I recognize the limitations of what I'm able to bind on you, what I'm not able to bind on you according to Scripture, right? The second thing I would say is I want to state this again very clearly, so there's no confusion. I believe it's possible to simultaneously say that, one, Christians must gather as churches, and two, occasions exist when they are providentially hindered from doing so. So I think, Collin, we can hold those two sentences together at the same time. So Christians must gather, one, and two, occasions exist in which we're providentially hindered from doing so. Now,
the problem is he determined that we were providentially hindered, therefore lock down your church. That's the issue. And now that he no longer can say, now that it's popular to say that we're not being providentially hindered, he has a book ready and he can make some money off of this big Eva grift. And that's sickening. He wasn't faithful from the beginning, and now he wants to write about why it's essential to gather. He needs to get into the back of the line on that issue, because he was nowhere to be found when that fight mattered, and now he wants to capitalize and make money off of it. That is a pure grift, and he's misrepresenting his views. I just read his views. He was all pro lockdowns and anti-gather in spite of the state. In May of 2020, that's what he wrote, and that was his position. And generally, that was just his position. I believe 9 Marks was writing more pro-lockdown articles prior to that, but I just wanted to point out his position. And even if we want to look at Collin Hansen's position, let's look at Collin Hansen's position real quick, where he's writing an article. He doesn't write too many articles, but this article was just so simping about how he was using the word quarantines instead of lockdowns and acting very naive about what the future would hold. And this was written April 2nd. So this is when Trump decided that 30 days to slow the spread was the right course of action. It wasn't. And betrayed his, let's be open for Easter. Wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? He betrayed that. Instead went to 30 days, I believe on April 2nd. So we'll gain a global perspective with national protection. So he's basically advocating this will be like how everything got better after 9/11. It's just so dumb. I just that was a really dumb article, and again, it was, this guy doesn't understand the times. Jonathan Leeman, I think, is more malicious in my opinion, whereas Collin Hansen's just your your NPC working at the Gospel Coalition. That's basically what Collin Hansen is. So I'm going to finish there. If you like this content, let me know what you think about what I think. Also, like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel. Those help with the magical YouTube algorithms. I haven't said that in a while. And also check out evangelicaldarkweb.org. We got articles, stuff like that. And subscribe to that as well if you want to support this ministry. And have a blessed day, and I will catch you on the next one.